Hello and welcome to Q&A. I'm Jay Nordlinger, and this podcast is brought to you by Donors Trust. Donors Trust is the community foundation for the Liberty Movement. If you want to support groups committed to limited government, personal responsibility, and free enterprise with your charitable giving, you should learn how Donors Trust can simplify your giving. Go to this web address, donorstrust.org/ricochet. Go now to get your free Investing in Liberty guide. And I'll have more to say about them later in this show. Our guest today is Daniel Hannan, the British writer and politician, the member of the European Parliament, the leading Brexiteer. And this is live and in person, live and in the flesh. Dan Hannan is at NRHQ, that is National Review headquarters in New York City. And it's a great pleasure to have him.
It's a great pleasure to be here. And what an incredibly handsome new headquarters you have. I'm very impressed.
Not so bad.
Yeah.
Not so bad.
Yeah, I was imagining you all struggling away as you have done since 1955 or whatever, never making a profit. But, there's obviously not such a bad life.
We've been spiffed up just a little bit.
Yeah, I can see.
Dan, we were just talking about America and what's good about it. One of the things good about it. And you were mentioning its star-spangled diversity, that seems like all of humanity is here in some form.
Yeah, in the most obvious sense that people have come here from every continent and archipelago, and the diversity of politics, of beliefs, of behavior, of norms is extraordinary. And this is why, anti-Americanism is a thing in a way that anti-Armenianism or anti-Argentinism isn't a thing. You never hear of somebody, the anti-Albanians or whatever, but when people are pinning their colours to that mast, they're really saying that they dislike the human race and the freedom that people will exploit to find their niche if they're given the opportunity.
Well, Dan, I've thought about this for a long time and written about it, but maybe the strangest anti-Americanism is the anti-Americanism of some Americans. I think a lot of us are almost taught to dislike our country. And I noticed this when I was a student abroad, that a lot of my fellow students were, frankly, ashamed of being American, and some tried to hide it.
Yeah, I think it's
by putting the maple leaf on their backpack.
Right, and I think that's to do with kind of the premium that the present age puts on victimhood and powerlessness. There's a strange gauge here where we don't look at the rights and wrongs of a country, we look at who's the underdog. And frankly, neither your country or mine is often the underdog. Even when we've been taking on the worst and most evil enemies, we've tended to have the technological upper hand because we industrialized early and we discovered the capitalist system and so on. And that leads some leftists into alliances with the most appalling people, the Chavist regime in Venezuela, the Castro regime in Cuba, simply because they're the underdog. And what's, I think, very curious about this, I mean, we have a leader of the opposition who does the equivalent. He will support every cause provided it's sufficiently Anglophobic.
Mr. Corbyn.
Jeremy Corbyn was pro-Hezbollah, pro-Hamas, pro-Soviet during the Cold War, pro-Chavez. He wouldn't even back us in the Falklands War. He wouldn't even back us against a fascist dictatorship. That was how much he hated his own country. He was asked in an interview, is there any conflict where you'd have been on our side? I mean, can you imagine that somebody needs to be asked that when he's aspiring for high office? The fact that the question needed to be put would in normal times have disqualified somebody. He had to really think about it. And eventually he said, well, the Second World War. Mm. And I was thinking, maybe after Operation Barbarossa, right?
Yeah.
I mean, not until 1941.
Yeah.
But of course, the reason that the left can point to that one is because that was about the only occasion where really Britain was the underdog. We were, as it were, standing alone against the might of a united totalitarian Eurasia, at least for the first third of the war. And so it's this. Bertrand Russell, I think, said, never make the mistake of thinking that people have superior virtue because they have been victimized. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the left struggle with that.
Dan, let's turn to a problem. It's something I'm genuinely confused about. Modern people would say conflicted. It might take me a minute to lay this out. I want to talk about Catalonia and Kurdistan and situations like that. I have this tension within me. I don't know what to think. I like national self-expression.
Yep.
I love Woodrow Wilson for this. He gave
one of his very few good points, but yeah, totally.
Yes, and the Albanians revere him, for example.
Yeah, and they were right about that.
People have a right to national self-expression. At the same time, you don't want an utterly balkanized world, and we can't have 500 members of the UN, I guess.
Why not?
Well, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I think in general, the move to more smaller and more democratic states over the last 100 years, I mean, on the Wilsonian principle, has been a good one. When the European Union was formed in the mid-50s, there were 80 countries in the world. Now there are 200. The most recent 30 of them have come into being since 1990. I think the latest ones are Montenegro and South Sudan, and if you count it, Kosovo. Has every one of those been a success? Obviously not. But how's the mood in general away from these great multinational empires, these Habsburg and Ottoman and Soviet multinational states? Has that been a good thing? I think on balance it has. Now, it's important to stress that self-determination is not synonymous with separatism. Catalonia may be said to have the right to self-determination, but Catalans may self-determine to remain Spanish, as the Scots self-determined to remain British, and that's equally a democratic...
Should it be 51 to 49, so to speak?
It's an interesting one, yeah.
The Kurds have had this debate for a long time. I remember speaking many years ago with the Iraqi foreign minister, a fellow named, I think his name is Zabari, I can't quite, but he's Kurdish. And I said, well, what about these people who say there ought to be 3 Iraqs, Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds? He said, well, isn't that up to us? We've made the decision to go for a united Iraq, but maybe people change their mind. But what about the Kurds and the Catalans who don't want to go along?
Well, the answer is, of course, that depends which country you're in. What's happened in Catalonia is, to British eyes, completely inexplicable, and I suspect to most Americans. The idea of police brutality and people being tried for sedition and the full force of the state being used to repress a vote, rather than simply saying, we don't recognize your vote, is, to us, quite extraordinary. And what's even more extraordinary...
The Spanish behaved badly. Really
badly. Well, here's the thing. I would have said so, and I'm deeply Hispanophile, as you know. Most of my... Yeah, not that makes you Hispanophile, but I've got to know Spain very well in later life, and I have many friends there, and most of my friends there are conservatives and unionists, and I've tended to see the Catalan issue through their eyes, and I was convinced that they were making a terrible mistake by this hardline crackdown. I thought that they were creating the thing that they purported to be against.
Yeah.
There was no very clear majority for Catalan independence, and... Funnily enough, I spoke to one of the people who's been arrested now the day before they declared the referendum. And he was very nervous about which way it was going to go. He didn't have the air of a man who was confident about having a united electorate behind him. And I think, frankly speaking, a lot of the Catalan separatists were using the threat of a referendum in the hope of getting more autonomy within Spain and finding a compromise that both sides could live with. Madrid was determined not to give them that option and responded by prosecutions and, dragging people away from the polls. And then, these guys who were arrested, they were stripped and stuck in the back of a police van while the Spanish national anthem was blared at them. This is not the behavior of a liberal democracy.
This is dictatorial stuff.
Yeah, and shall I tell you the weirdest thing, Jay? The weirdest thing? You would think that would push every previously undecided Catalan voter into
I would have thought.
Being a separatist, right? I have no doubt that that's what would happen in the UK, and I'm pretty certain it's what would happen here.
Yeah.
And yet, if the polls are to be believed, there's been a slight swing, first of all, away from the pro-independence parties in Catalonia, and secondly, away from the concept of separation as an abstract principle. So I'm just left asking the question, are we different? These things that would have so obviously been counterproductive in an English-speaking country. Is it possible that they've worked there, that Catalans have just said, you know what, we don't want the hassle? There's an argument for independence, but not if it involves police repression and crackdowns and all this disagreeable and difficult stuff. maybe there's just a cultural difference that explains why this authoritarianism, and to our eyes, this almost dictatorial behavior by the Madrid authorities actually is more culturally suited to that country.
Dan, I'd like to turn to one of the subjects about which you are expert, namely immigration. You may have heard me say this in some context. I love to quote Charles Rosen, the late pianist scholar, who said, "The death of classical music is perhaps the oldest tradition of classical music." In other words, every generation says, this is it.
It's like the death of the novel, yeah.
We won't have classical music anymore.
Right.
And yet some people say, will there come a day when it's actually true? Every previous generation has said this, but someday will it be true? Now, I know, as you have pointed out, that every generation, let's talk about Americans now, I know the American scene better than the British scene, that people in every generation have said, immigration in the past was fine. We could handle it. The numbers were okay.
But this time it's different.
This time it's different because it's the wrong people.
Because they're Catholics or they're not white or there's always a new factor that makes it apparently different.
Might there come a day when it's true?
Well, I think the answer is it depends how you handle it. If you handle immigration sensibly, by which I mean attracting people as individuals rather than en bloc, bringing them from a diversity of different countries so that you avoid ghettoization, and taking people who have come because they choose to, because they want to be here, then I think it can be incredibly successful. And, there have been occasional glitches in the past. And as you say, these are not new concerns. If you'd been in this city 100 years ago, you'd have heard exactly the same, but there are parts of New York where you only hear people speaking Yiddish or Italian or Polish,
Chinese.
And yet, it's tended to work out. I think it's more than anything about self-belief, about projecting a brand and a culture that offers people something to assimilate into. And the United States has traditionally been incredibly good at that. As in, it's not unique. I mean, Australia does and Canada. And actually, Britain has been pretty good by global standards.
Of course.
If you look at the countries where that sense is weakest, you have the worst problems, I would say, with assimilation. So not far from where I work in Brussels is the rather deprived and ugly district of Molenbeek, which is where the Paris bombers came from, and actually it's been a big generator of terrorism. And I can't help wondering whether that isn't partly a reflection of how difficult Belgians find it to say anything positive about their state. There's no Belgian language, there's no Belgian culture, there's no Belgian history. The country is an uneasy and slightly unhappy union of two different peoples who read two sets of newspapers, watch two sets of TV stations, vote for two sets of political parties. People are groping back towards those older patriotisms as Flemish or Walloon. So where does that leave a child of Moroccan immigrants in Molenbeek? He's not Flemish, he's not Walloon. Every interaction he's had with the Belgian state has taught him to despise it. If he got any history at all in his school, it will have been presented to him as a hateful exploitation and racism and all the rest of it. So it's not in a sense surprising that people there are casting around for a different kind of identity, looking for somebody who's a little bit more assertive, looking for something that they can belong to. There's something that, young men in every age and nation tend to go through. Now, the one thing that these jihadi madmen do not lack is self-confidence. I mean, if you're in the market for an assertive identity, the Islamic State is offering you one. And, we're talking about proportionately a very small number, but it's maybe not surprising that some people fall for it. And I can't help feeling that the antidote is give them an identity that everyone is visibly proud of belonging to so that you never get to the point of casting around for an alternative.
Dan, did Chancellor Merkel in Germany make a mistake? Did she blunder badly in permitting all of that immigration or migration?
It's too soon to tell. I have to say, at the height of the crisis 2 years ago, you wouldn't have believed that she would have been re-elected. So in that sense, she's pulled it off. She's persuaded Germany to do it. And I think this is partly... Germany is a bit different. Most Germans have somewhere in their recent family history experience of forced migration. You know, we avert our eyes, we who are on the Western side in the war, from quite how much suffering was inflicted on the ethnic Germans of Central and Eastern Europe. 17 million Germans were displaced. Now, that's an awful lot of people who have some connection in modern Germany and who know what it's like to be made homeless.
That Volga-Deutsch.
The Volksdeutsch, exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, from everywhere, from the Baltic states, from Ukraine, from Russia, as well as obviously from Silesia and Pomerania and so on. And you know, that's
now antique terms, but they were once quite live. Yeah.
But so, you know, think of how many guys who were driving your cab in Munich had somewhere in their family tree an experience of this. And I think that maybe makes it a slightly different culture.
I'm Jay Nordlinger with Q&A. We're talking with Daniel Hannan, the writer, politician, Renaissance man, I would say, back after this word from our sponsor. It's unwise to rely on politicians for policy ideas. Better to rely on think tanks, public interest law centers, and other principled groups and individuals from around the country. The best ones are those who do not rely on government money to operate. If you want to help move the ideas of liberty forward, invest your charitable giving in those doing the real work of liberty causes. And the simplest way to do this is through Donors Trust. Donors Trust is the community foundation for the liberty movement. With a donor-advised fund at Donors Trust, you'll simplify your giving and receive excellent tax benefits, all in a way that gives you an additional layer of privacy. All donor-advised funds offer the same basic services, but Donors Trust is the only donor-advised fund that shares your commitment to conservative or classical liberal principles. Go to donorstrust.org/ricochet for your free Investing in Liberty guide that gives advice on how to identify principle-driven charities that deserve your support. As we near the end of 2017, Donors Trust is the partner you need. The stock market is booming and the tax code is changing. Donors Trust experts can help you navigate all of this and equip you to give in a way that best benefits you, your family, and the principles you hold dear. Visit donorstrust.org/ricochet right now to download a free copy of your helpful guide. Discover a better way to support the values you believe in. That's donorstrust.org/ricochet. Welcome back to Q&A. I'm Jay Nordlinger, sitting with Dan Hannan in the offices of National Review in New York City. Dan, as you know, is not just a writer, not just a politician, but a kind of leader for a kind of conservatism. What kind of conservatism? That's a big question. That's a question a lot of us have been talking about. I tend to like rhymes. I like wordplay. And I've said recently that the great fault line on the right I can express in a rhyme. Is it Bannon or Hannan? You want Bannon or Hannan?
It's a no-brainer when you put it like that, isn't it? But funnily enough, I'm actually I'm just about to teach a course in conservatism at a university, which is something I've never lectured at a university as part of a formal course, rather than just coming in to do a one-off guest lecture.
The students are lucky.
Well, I'm having now to actually remind myself of the different strands and to start reading Russell Kirk and Roger Scruton and all the basic texts about defining what conservatism is.
I once said to Robert Conquest, "What are you?" And he said, "Well, I've been described as a Burkean conservative, and I guess I'll accept that. But I think of what Orwell said," he said. He spoke of the law and liberty lands, and I like to think of myself as a law and liberty man. I think of you as a law and liberty man.
Yeah, I'm disappointed that Robert Conquest didn't turn it into a limerick, which, of course, Nordlinger, he was incredibly good at doing.
He could have on the spot.
Yeah.
Let's talk about something that's roiling my camp at the moment, namely nationalism. I suppose there are benign kinds of nationalism and less benign kinds. It was never really a good word in my vocabulary. And I read recently an essay by the late Ken Minogue about nationalism. And he said something like, it's often a substitute religion, a kind of nation worship or blood worship for those without religion. I think everyone has a kind word to say about patriotism, maybe not some on the left, but certainly all conservatives have kind words to say about patriotism. Let's discuss this N word, if you will, nationalism. What do you make of it?
Well, I mean, I think the opposition to it, especially in Europe, is rooted in the idea that it leads to wars. That it was bad enough having these medieval wars among kings, but it was much more terrifying to have populations rushing enthusiastically into the conflicts, which they regarded as the product of the nation state. I'm always reminded of what the great aphorist and theologian G.K. Chesterton said, which is, condemning patriotism because it can lead to war is like condemning love because it can lead to murder. I have not seen anyone anywhere come up with a better way of organizing your affairs than within a national unit. In other words, within a unit whose people feel enough in common, one with another, to accept government from each other's hands. I think that's the basic definition. If you want to have a functioning liberal democracy, you've got to draw the boundaries somewhere, and the best way of drawing the boundaries is to allow the people who live there to decide where it should be. Now, I totally get that it's complicated. People sustain multiple identities. You can feel Kurdish and Iraqi or Catalan and Spanish or whatever. Sure. Populations are interspersed. There are not always neat boundaries. There are historical claims. There are geographical considerations. All of these things are important qualifiers. But I start from the proposition that you are better off if your prejudice is towards some kind of ethnographic boundary, as it would have been called 100 years ago. In other words, letting the people decide within what unit to have their democratic decisions.
Dan, to speak personally, you don't really feel English, do you? You feel British. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think that's... well, I mean, I'm not really English, although I live in England and represent an English district, but... regard England as the strongest vessel down the centuries of liberty until Philadelphia. But... no, I mean, I'm not English by birth or by ancestry.
I often quote Bill Buckley, who said, on many things, as listeners know, but I'm thinking of within every conservative is a streak of libertarianism. How wide is your streak? I often say mine is like an accordion. It expands and contracts depending. I also think that within every conservative is a streak, only a streak, of populism.
Well, maybe those two streaks are what make a conservative.
Perhaps.
It's the moderate, because conservatism, surely, if it's anything, is something that is rooted in reality. It goes with the grain of human nature. It doesn't impose some rationalist theory. And the reality is that most people do identify on some level tribally. And so where the pure libertarian might say this is such an irrational thing to do, there should be no states and therefore there should be no nations because we should all just be autonomous individuals, that doesn't apply in this sublunary world that we inhabit. And the conservative says, okay, how do you then maximize freedom given that in every human breast there is a desire for group identity on some level, almost all. And I come back to saying there is no securer vessel for freedom than the nation state. You look at every ideology that has purported to be bigger than nationhood. The Jacobins, the fascists, the communists, now the Islamic fundamentalists. All of them who say, we don't recognize your territorial jurisdiction. We answer to a higher law than this. Very, very interesting that the signature act of the Islamic Revolution in Iran was to besiege the embassy. I mean, that was a statement that, your idea of national sovereignty just means nothing to us. You really extraordinarily symbolic event.
I love this line from Khomeini, Dan. I didn't lead this revolution in order to lower the price of watermelons.
Right.
He was after bigger fish, global fish.
Yeah. And like every, and he meant what he said. Like the French Revolution, like the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution spilled out from behind its borders and tried to replicate itself around the world because they didn't recognize territorial jurisdiction. And this is why I come, all of those ideologies in the end are defeated by nation states. Nation states are imperfect, they can fail or succeed, but they are the best place to give freedom and individual autonomy a chance to flourish. And that, I think, is why the conservative, who is pro-freedom, because we all do have this libertarian streak, recognizes the validity of patriotism and the legitimacy of national claims, because he understands that if you are too theoretical and abstract, you lose freedom itself.
Dan, let me give you an example of a kind of populism or populist expression I don't like, and that I see and hear a lot of. I don't know if you read about this little controversy, but a tiny company in Montana, Whitefish, that's the hometown of our Secretary of the Interior, got this contract for, I think, $300 million. It had to do with the restoration of Puerto Rico after that devastating hurricane. It's a two-man company in this little place, and it just stank to high heaven, this deal. The contract's since been rescinded. But the Secretary of the Interior tweeted, I believe this is verbatim, "Only in elitist Washington, D.C. would being from a small town be considered a crime." Now, politicians often talk like this, and I've seen it be very, very effective, and I think it's distressing.
Yes. I mean, you can always stir up...
Can you divorce populism from demagoguery, I wonder? Suppose so.
Isn't the answer that populism is based on exactly the sentiment that you just quoted from that tweet? It's based on the idea that a remote elite is not governing in the interests of the general population, but is governing in the interests of itself. Now, this may sound a trite or even obvious point, but surely the validity of populism depends on whether that is an accurate assessment of the situation.
Yeah. Is it true or false?
Is it true or false? Now, right. We can all think of actual oligarchies down the ages, including from time to time here, where populism is a legitimate antibody, because there really is a self-interested elite with its
sometimes we feel like we want to be a peasant with a pitchfork, as Pat Buchanan said.
Right. And that is, on the other hand, it's become, as you say, such a sort of bromide that rolls off the tongue. I mentioned to you in one of these previous podcasts, Jay, that I regard The Simpsons as the fount of almost all wisdom. And there's an early episode where Montgomery Burns, the evil nuclear power station owner, stands for governor. And at every rally, he has the same slogan, which is, "We're going to show those pen pushers in the Capitol." And everyone goes wild and cheers, And it's funny because we've all seen this ludicrous overuse of something that is, often not valid.
Say the striped pants set. Remember that one?
Yeah, exactly. the stripy pants from Foggy Bottom, exactly. So, If I look at current U.S. politics, I think, well, there is a legitimate democratic way that you can rid yourself of people you don't like. If you don't like those pen pushers down in the Capitol, you vote for somebody else, right? Now, if you are if you were a Catalan or Kurd saying, well, hang on, I've just voted and it's been crushed, then it might be a much more legitimate thing to complain. If you don't like the fact that the European Commission is run by 27 unelected functionaries that you can't get rid of, that might be a legitimate reaction to say these are people running in affairs in their own interests and doing very nicely out of it financially. But the US, by global standards, really doesn't have that problem. If anything, it has the opposite problem. It has the problem that you just quoted, that, anyone portraying himself as being anti-elite is kind of given the benefit of the doubt, and his own faults are overlooked.
Well, Dan, we're wrapping up here, and I need to let you get to lunch, but I want to ask you three quickish ones, if I may. I know a few Brits and cherish them. And I get the impression from some of them, conservatives I mean, that an anti-abortion position seems eccentric to them. Seems like an American oddity. Some of our friends think this, and they've asked me about it in all sincerity, not necessarily in a mocking way, but it's befuddling to them that so many Americans, so many of us, may I say, hold an anti-abortion view. Is it an eccentric position in British politics?
I mean, you know my country better than almost anyone, and I've always said you're the best kind of Anglophile because you see our faults very clearly and you forgive them. But I think the real difference is that issues of this kind for a long time in the UK, have been depoliticised because they are all subject to conscience votes in the House of Commons. By tradition, you never impose a party whip on a vote on euthanasia, gay marriage, abortion, any of those things. So each member of Parliament is allowed to vote with his conscience, and there'd be quite a backlash really against. There is a bit of a backlash when party leaders try and push the boundaries on that, and so it's not that it's considered eccentric to have an absolute opposition to abortion. It's considered eccentric to be talking about it in a political context, because these are just not political issues.
I see. Dan, if this question's not too personal, but some people I know, and I think many of your fans in America, perhaps in Britain too, I don't know, wonder this. They wonder why you're not in the British Parliament at Westminster. You're in the European Parliament. So why isn't our man Dan in the British Parliament? Is that too personal?
Well, I feel I've just kind of done my bit here now, Jay. I've been in the European Parliament for nearly 20 years when Brexit takes effect, and I go looking for something else. And I think that is, you don't want to be a full-time professional politician. I mean, no conservative should ever aspire to do that. You go into politics because you want to get something done, but when you've got it done...
For a second? Winston Churchill was in politics for 60 years or so. Is that exceptional? A great big asterisk? Of course, he did other things, didn't he? A little writing on the side.
I can't answer that briefly.
No.
But...
Yeah. Sorry about
other
that.
Than...
It's unfair of me. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing, and this is why the danger of trying to concertina my views, because what I'm going to say is very controversial. But other than the period of the war leadership, Churchill's career was not a great success. The narratives of Churchill, especially on this side of the Atlantic, where he's beyond criticism, where people don't see him as a flawed human being, but as a sort of symbol of something. The narrative almost always begins with him sort of, in the wilderness, overlooked in the mid-1930s, firing off warnings about the Messerschmitt production or whatever.
It's like you're quoting me directly.
Right, but let's just look at his life up until then, or look at his political career. First of all, the extraordinary ratting and re-ratting, which even he admitted was indefensible. The role he played in bringing Turkey into the First World War against us.
Does that mean party switching?
Exactly. He jumped ship for preferment. He was quite flagrant about it. His party was losing, the other one was on the up, so he jumped and indeed became a minister. And then when the parties flipped around in strength, he jumped back to say, and he turned it away with a quip, but he didn't try and justify that behaviour in terms of decency. He presided over the arguably the most sort of avoidable disaster in the First World War, the Dardanelles campaign. He rejoined the gold standard at the pre-war rate, thereby inflicting a recession which could have been minimized or completely avoided. He almost prompted a revolution when he sent troops against some striking miners. I suppose what I'm saying is there was a reason why he was in the wilderness by the mid-30s, right? It was not that people were ganging up on him out of sheer nastiness. He had patriotism and vision, but there were real questions over his judgment. Now, he then got one call right, and it was the big call that he got right, that he saw Hitler for what he was, and that cancels out what had gone before, and it also cancels out, frankly, what came afterwards, because his second premiership was pretty lamentable. So I can't even remember why we're talking about Churchill.
We're talking about career politicians. We're talking about career politicians.
I think I just kind of, I don't know. One day when I'm brave enough, I will write a book. Now, look, don't get me wrong. I still think Churchill was a good thing. Of course I do. But I just think
this is a conversation.
There is a black and white view of this issue, which I think overlooks his faults because he was a human being, and I think is particularly unfair to Neville Chamberlain, because in order to magnify Churchill, we have to diminish Chamberlain. And
who had time for Chamberlain? Churchill.
Oh yes, yeah, all the time. Yeah, no question. Yeah. No, this demonisation of Chamberlain actually really had its origins in a pamphlet written by Michael Foot, who was then a young journalist and became the Labour leader in the early 80s. Who was determined to exculpate Labour for having been pro-disarmament and having precipitated the crisis. And so they needed to find another villain, and he wrote a book, or a pamphlet called Guilty Men, which everything you and I, everything that we think we know about that period, what you said was, I was quoting you with a familiar narrative.
Yeah, right.
That basically is Michael Foot's narrative. That's where we all get it from.
I must not repeat that then. We'll end on this, Dan. On another British figure. Would you mind saying something about Arthur Balfour and his declaration? I believe it's been 100 years.
Almost to the day, yes. Yes. Well, I think this really ties in to what you were saying right at the beginning about Wilsonian self-determination. People, for some reason, this is almost never said, but I don't think you can divorce Zionism from the general move and the generally, the generally happy move towards national self-determination. So by 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was made, national self-determination had become an allied war aim. And we were explicitly saying, the Americans and us, that we were going to replace these shambling Habsburg and Romanov and Ottoman states with something more ethnographic, that there would be a country for the Armenians and a country for the Lithuanians and a country for the Hungarians and so on. So, of course, this was going to leave millions of European Jews as a minority everywhere. And it would have been bizarre had they not said, well, hang on, where do we go then? Well, if everyone else is getting their country, what about us? And that was the context of the Balfour Declaration, which is often missed. And as I say, I think it's a good thing that there was this move towards nation states. There'd been this attempt to have a Zionist plantation in Uganda, where the climate was thought to be good, but it had rapidly become clear that only the Holy Land had the pull, the magnetic power to bring people. Now, it was interesting. The Palestinians and some British leftists were demanding an apology from the British government. And the British government, to its credit, was incredibly robust about this. It didn't just not apologize. It put out a statement saying, we are proud of our role in the creation of the State of Israel, and we see nothing to apologize for, And I think that's right. Now, that's not because Israel is perfect. Israel, like every country, has had its shameful moments. But look at the alternatives in that region.
It's one of Britain's finest hours.
And it was a fundamentally unsordid and unselfish act. Although the people who were determined to blame everything on us are always casting around for some ulterior motive. Was it to strengthen American support for the First World War, or was it to create a kind of Jewish protectorate to guard the Suez Canal? I mean, come on. You guys had joined the war 6 months earlier. We had Egypt, for goodness sake. We didn't need to worry about the Suez Canal at that stage. We were doing this because of Balfour's genuine commitment, A, to the national principle as an abstract theory, and B, his belief that Jewish people he said one of the world's most gifted races is everywhere being badly treated, and people deserve better than what they're getting in the Austro-Hungarian and Russian states. And I think things have worked out. I mean, let's not lose sight of what's happened. Sure, there's a flip side. If you understand why Palestinians lament their displacement, and who wouldn't in their situation, and Israel has on occasion behaved badly, as every country does. But in a region where autocracy is normal, here is a country that has remained not just a democracy, but a gloriously cussed, disputatious, pluralist democracy. And which I think, what you were talking about, the law and liberty, I mean, this is a law and liberty country. I remember last time I was in Jerusalem, the guy who'd installed the security barrier showing me where he'd put it in, and he pointed to a part of it, and he said, I wanted to have that hill over there, where I'd have the commanding heights. But the Israeli courts ordered me to move the route here because my proposed route would have violated the property rights of a Palestinian olive farmer. He wouldn't have had it. And I thought, in how many countries in this region would the general unhesitatingly give way to the judge? And that's something that I think Israel took from the Anglosphere tradition. It's common law democracy. And that is something that we should feel proud of, like any good parent.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Jay Nordlinger for Q&A, and with all due respect to the U.S. Constitution, which I revere, Hannan for President. Thank you, and goodbye.
Ricochet. Join the conversation.